first time I really noticed the man in 4B was because of a broken egg, not a metaphor. An actual egg. One of the brown organic ones I'd started buying after my ex-husband told me the white ones tasted lower class, that slipped out of my grocery bag in the hallway and cracked open on the floor between our two doors. I just stood there looking at it. Yolks spreading slow across the tile, and I thought, that's about right. I'd been in the Ashwood Arms building for 11 days. I was 31 years old. I had a rolling suitcase, a box of books, and a checking account with $412 in it. Everything else, the house in Naperville, the joint savings, the life I thought I was building, belonged to someone who decided I wasn't worth finishing what we started. His name was Marcus. We met when I was 25, married at 27, and by the time I was 30, I knew something was wrong but couldn't name it yet. He had a way of making the wrong thing feel like your idea. The fertility testing, for example. He suggested it with such concern in his voice, such gentleness, that it took me 3 months to realize he'd never once suggested testing himself. The results came back with nothing wrong on my end. He said that was great news, and then he stopped talking about children entirely. 6 months after that, he sat me down at the our kitchen table, the one I'd found at an estate sale and refinished myself, and told me he thought we'd grown apart, that he needed someone who matched his energy. Those were his words, matched his energy. Like I was a light bulb with the wrong wattage. I signed the separation papers 2 weeks later. My mother-in-law, who I genuinely loved, sent me a fruit basket with a card that said, "Wishing you clarity." Marcus's attorney called the following Monday to inform me that, per our prenuptial agreement, I was entitled to what I'd brought into the marriage, my personal belongings and a one-time payment of $5,000, which Marcus had already wired to my account as a show of goodwill. $5,000. 4 years. The math of that kept me awake for weeks. I found the apartment on a Thursday, moved in on a Saturday, and by the following Tuesday, I was standing in the hallway watching an egg die on the floor. You want me to get that? I looked up. The door to 4B was open, and there was a man leaning against the frame, watching me with an expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite concern. Medium height, dark hair, going a little gray at the temples. He was holding a dish towel in one hand, like he'd been in the middle of something. "I've got it," I said. "I have paper towels. I have paper towels, too." He nodded, like that was a completely reasonable thing to say, and went back inside. I cleaned up the egg. I told myself I wasn't embarrassed. His name, I found out from our building super, was Cole Whitaker. He'd lived in 4B for 3 years, kept to himself, paid on time, no complaints. The super said that last part like it was the highest possible praise a person could receive. I didn't think much about Cole Whitaker in those early weeks. I was too busy surviving. I'd left my marketing coordinator job 2 years into the marriage when Marcus's schedule made it logistically difficult. Another one of his phrases that I'd accepted without examining, and my resume had a gap in it now that I spent a lot of late nights trying to explain in cover letters. I picked up freelance work. A local bakery needed social media help. A pediatric dentist's office wanted a newsletter. I made enough to cover the rent on 4B, which was $1,100 a month, and not much else. Cole and I developed a hallway acquaintanceship. The kind where you nod, sometimes say something about the weather or the elevator being slow, and both pretend that's a sufficient human interaction. He had a dog, a big, calm shepherd mix, named something I couldn't quite catch the first time he said it. The dog was more sociable than Cole. She would stop and press her nose against my hand every time we passed each other, and Cole would stand there holding the leash, looking like he was unsure whether to apologize for her or not. "She likes you," he said one morning in October. "She likes everyone," I said. "She really doesn't." I looked at the dog. The dog looked back at me with an expression of complete sincerity. "What's her name?" I asked. "Scout." I laughed before I could stop myself. "Of course it is." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but getting closer to one. It was small. That's what I want to say about those early months. Everything was small. A word in the hallway, Scout stopping to lean against my leg while Cole pretended not to notice. Once in late October, I locked myself out of 4A and Cole had a spare key that our super had given him when the previous tenant was elderly and needed a check-in system. He handed it to me without making anything of it. And I stood in my doorway for a minute after he'd gone back inside, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Like someone had just quietly done a decent thing without needing me to be grateful. I called my mother that night. She lives in Tucson, retired, tends an aggressive herb garden, and gives advice whether you've asked for it or not. The neighbor sounds nice, she said. I was talking about the locksmith being expensive. You were talking about the neighbor. I changed the subject. November came and Marcus resurfaced. Not in a dramatic way. He wasn't standing outside my building. Nothing like that. He sent an email asking if I'd found my grandmother's bracelet. The silver one I used to wear. He thought it might still be in the bathroom drawer. I read it 4 times trying to find the real question underneath it and couldn't. I wrote back that I had the bracelet, thanks. He replied, good, glad it's safe. And that was it. But I sat with my phone in my hand for an hour afterward, feeling like I'd been tested on something and wasn't sure if I'd passed. I ran into Cole in the laundry room that night. He was folding a flannel shirt with the kind of focused precision that made me think he'd lived alone for a long time. You okay? He asked, without looking up. Fine. You've been staring at that dryer door for about 4 minutes. I had been. My ex-husband emailed me about a bracelet. Cole folded the shirt, set it down. Did you want him to email you about something else? No, I said. And then, surprising myself, I wanted him to not email me at all, and also to somehow know that I'm doing fine without him having to be told. That's a reasonable thing to want. It's completely irrational. Still reasonable. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed out loud alone in a room with someone in I don't know how long. It felt strange, and then it felt okay. We talked for 40 minutes in that laundry room. I found out he'd grown up in Cincinnati, spent 8 years in the Navy, worked now in something he described as consulting, with a slight pause before the word that I noticed but didn't ask about. He'd been in Chicago for 6 years. No, he hadn't found a community here exactly, but he liked the lake. He went running along the lakefront most mornings. I told him I'd grown up outside Columbus, studied communications, married someone I thought I knew, and turned out to know mostly the surface of. The surface can look a lot like the whole thing, he said. It really can. I went back upstairs at 11:30 carrying warm laundry and thinking about that sentence. December was hard. The holidays have a way of making an empty apartment feel specifically empty rather than just regular empty. My mother wanted me to come to Tucson, and I almost did, but I got in a larger freelance contract, a regional restaurant group that needed a full rebrand, and I couldn't afford to lose the momentum. I ordered pad thai and watched old movies and texted my college roommate long threads about nothing. Cole knocked on my door on the 23rd with a tin of cookies. Actual cookies, snickerdoodles, which are a very specific and considered choice. I bake when I have time off, he said, in a tone that made it clear he was prepared for me to find this unusual. I'm not going to make fun of you for baking snickerdoodles. Some people have opinions. Those people are wrong. I took the tin. Do you want to come in? He came in. We sat at my small kitchen table and drank coffee and talked until almost midnight, and at some point the conversation moved from easy surface things to the underneath of things, the way it sometimes does late at night with someone who's paying real attention. He'd lost a close friend, a guy he'd served with 4 years ago. That had been the thing that unmoored him, he said. Not the Navy itself, Not the transition out, but the specific loss of that particular person who'd known him in a way that's hard to replicate after a certain age. I told him about the fertility testing, about how I'd spent months wondering if my body had failed my marriage, and how it took me a long time to think about the fact that Marcus had simply never gotten tested at all. That the story I'd been handed, we tried and it didn't work, had very quietly placed all the weight on me. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a particular kind of cruelty. The kind that doesn't know it's being cruel. I think he knew, I said. I think you're probably right. He left at 10 past midnight. I stood at the window and watched snow come down on Wabash Avenue and thought about the specific quality of his attention. The way he listened like he was actually cataloging what you said, keeping it, not just waiting for his turn to speak. I hadn't been listened to like that in years. Maybe longer than I'd admitted to myself. January, I got the restaurant rebrand contract confirmed at a number that made me sit down on my kitchen floor. Not an enormous number by Chicago standards, but enough to breathe. I told Cole in the hallway the next morning, and he said, "That's great," in a tone that was so genuinely pleased that Scout picked up on it and wagged her whole body. "We should celebrate," he said, and then looked like he immediately wasn't sure he should have said that. "We should," I said. We went to dinner at a small Italian place on Randolph that he'd been to a few times. Candles and wine bottles on the table. The kind of restaurant that makes no fuss about being romantic and therefore is completely romantic, We split a bottle of Barolo and I found out he was 37, that he'd been briefly engaged in his late 20s to a woman who eventually moved to Portland, that he kept a very organized bookshelf, organized by subject, not author, because he disagreed with the convention. I told him my system was complete chaos, and he looked like he'd expected that. Walking home along the river, our breath visible in the cold air, he reached over and took my hand. Not making anything of it, just holding it. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. We walked 6 blocks like that. It was another 2 weeks before he kissed me, standing in my doorway after a Sunday afternoon where we'd done almost nothing. Walked Scout, made soup in my kitchen, read separate books in the same room. He kissed me like he'd been thinking about it for a while and had decided now was exactly the right time. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel terrified. I'd been wrong about someone's entire interior life before. I'd looked at Marcus and seen depth and found mostly performance. How do you trust your own judgment again after that? You don't, fully. You just keep paying attention. February brought Marcus again. Not an email this time. My attorney called to say Marcus was contesting a small asset I'd kept. A vintage camera that had belonged to my grandfather, claiming he'd contributed to its restoration cost 2 years ago. The amount in question was $300. My attorney, who charged me $270 an hour, explained this with the patience of a person who has learned not to comment on the rationality of their clients' exes. I told Cole that night, trying to make it a funny story, and watched his face do something still and controlled. "What does your attorney recommend?" "She says it's not worth fighting, just give him the $300. "Don't do that," he said. "It's $300. It's not about $300. I knew he was right. I also knew I was tired, and that $300 felt at that moment like a price I could pay to just be done. "How does he keep finding reasons?" I asked. Cole looked at me. "Because so far it's worked. You respond. That's the information he's collecting." I thought about that for a long time. What I didn't know then, what I found out later, in a way that rearranged everything, was why Cole had gone so still when I mentioned Marcus. Why he chose his words so carefully every time my ex-husband came up. Why there was always that pause before consulting. Cole Whitaker was a licensed private investigator. He'd been one for 4 years, since leaving the Navy. His firm, which he ran with two partners, specialized in financial fraud and domestic asset cases. He had a roster of clients in 6 states. The consulting was real, the quiet was professional, and the reason he'd moved into the Ashwood Arms 3 years ago had nothing to do with the reasonable rent. He told me in March. Sitting on my couch after dinner, Scout asleep across his feet, he said, "There's something I should have told you earlier, and I want to tell you now." I thought. I don't know what I thought. Something bad. Something that would revise everything. When I moved into this building, he said, I was working a case, a financial investigation. One of my clients had been referred by Marcus Ellery's firm. There were questions about how certain prenuptial agreements had been structured and enforced. Whether the terms were being applied selectively. I heard my own breathing. I was here because I was building a file, he said. That was the reason, at the beginning. I want you to know that because you're going to think of all the moments in the hallway, in the laundry room, and I need you to know that I knew who you were before the egg, before any of it. I stood up. I walked to the window. Chicago in March is the ugliest it ever gets. Gray sky. Leftover snow turned brown on the curbs. The lake still frozen and mean-looking. I stood there and tried to sort out what I was feeling. Say something, he said. How many other people what? Were affected by Marcus, by whatever he was doing? A pause. 4 confirmed cases, possibly more. Prenuptials that were written by his family's firm, weighted significantly in their favor, enforced in ways that the women involved, all of them, didn't fully understand when they signed. 4. There were 4 of us. Am I still part of the investigation? You were never a target. I needed to understand what you knew, whether you'd noticed anything that could contribute to the case. He stopped. I should have told you sooner. I kept finding reasons not to, and I know what that means, and I'm not going to pretend it was about anything except that I didn't want to lose what we'd started. I stayed at the window for a long time. Scout came and pressed her nose against the back of my knee. I thought about the kitchen table I'd refinished, the bracelet email, $300, and my grandfather's camera. 4 years of a marriage that had been, in some technical and deliberate way, designed to be easy to end. The prenup, I said. Could I have contested it? With the right documentation, yes. There are grounds. My client's attorney is building that argument now, and your situation has significant parallels. Why didn't you just tell me that? Because I was afraid you'd run and He stopped. Started again. Because I wanted you to trust me first, and I knew that was backwards, and I did it anyway. I turned around. He looked like a man who had fully prepared to have the door closed on him, and was sitting there accepting that possibility with the same still-faced composure he brought to everything. Is any of it real? I asked. The dinners, the hand, the snickerdoodles. Yes. You can't just say yes. I know. I'm saying it anyway. I sat back down on the couch. Not next to him, across from him, where I could see his face. I need to think, I said. I know. You should probably go. I know. He went. Scout looked at me from the doorway like she had an opinion about this and thought less of me for it. I called my mother at 11:30 that night. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was unlike her. Is he a good man? She asked. I think so. That's the problem. I think so, and I've thought so before. You didn't think so before, she said. You wanted it to be so. There's a difference, and you know it. I didn't sleep. I thought about every conversation we'd had, looking for the architecture of manipulation, and couldn't find it. What I found instead was the opposite. Someone who'd had opportunities to steer me and hadn't. Who'd told me not to give Marcus the $300. Who'd listened in a laundry room at midnight without trying to become my solution. I knocked on his door the next morning. He answered looking like he hadn't slept either. I want to see the file, I said. Whatever you have on Marcus. I want to understand what was done. Okay, and I want to talk to your client's attorney. I can arrange that. And then we're going to talk about everything else. Yes, not yet. First the file. Understood. The file was 47 pages. I read it over 2 days in Cole's apartment, Scout sleeping next to me on the couch, Cole working at his desk without hovering. Marcus's family firm had been structuring prenuptial agreements for their clients for 11 years in ways that systematically undervalued the contributions of the opposing spouse. Not illegally, on the surface, but in ways that an experienced family law attorney could challenge. Particularly if there was a pattern across multiple cases. There was a pattern. I met with the attorney, a woman named Denise, on a Friday afternoon in her office in the Loop. She had the kind of calm that comes from having been correct many times in situations where other people weren't. She walked me through what I was entitled to contest, what documentation would strengthen the case, what the realistic range of outcomes looked like. Best case, I asked? A structured settlement. Restitution of deferred marital assets, which in your case we'd argue includes your career interruption, the equity in the Naperville property, and the investment accounts you were excluded from during the marriage. I asked her to be specific. She was specific. I sat with a number I hadn't imagined and thought about $5,000 and a fruit basket from a woman who'd wished me clarity. Marcus's attorney reached out 6 weeks later to discuss a resolution. Marcus himself sent one email during that period. Not about a bracelet this time, nothing casual. His attorney had clearly told him to stop. The email was 2 lines. I hope we can resolve this without further disruption. I'd like to preserve what civility we have. I didn't respond. The settlement came through in June. I'm not going to say the number. I'll say it was enough to change the architecture of my life. I put a portion in a money market account. I paid my mother's property taxes for the year, which she cried about, and then pretended she hadn't. I set aside enough for a real emergency fund, the kind you're supposed to have before you actually need it. Cole and I went for a long walk along the lakefront the evening the settlement was finalized. It was warm, finally. One of those early Chicago summer nights where the whole city seems to exhale. Scout ran ahead and came back. Are you all right? He asked. I don't know what I am, I said. Lighter, maybe. Lighter is good. I spent 4 years making myself smaller, I said, fitting into a space someone else decided was the right size for me. And the whole time I thought that was just marriage. Compromise. I didn't know there was a version where the space was deliberately cut small. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to make it into a lesson. I'm angry, I said. I keep thinking I should be past the angry part, and I'm not. You don't have to be past it. I know. I just want to be. We walked for another mile. The water was doing that flat silver thing it does at evening in June. I want to ask you something, I said. All right. When did it stop being about the case? He thought about it. Really thought, in the way he did everything, like the answer was somewhere specific and he was locating it. The laundry room, he said, the night of the bracelet email. You said you wanted him to not contact you at all and also somehow know you were fine. And you call that irrational. And I thought, you're not irrational at all. You're just honest about wanting 2 things at once. And I don't know very many people who are honest about that. I looked at the lake. That's a very specific memory, I said. I have a specific kind of mind. I reached over and took his hand. We stayed in the Ashwood Arms for another 8 months. Then Cole's lease came up and mine came up and we found a 2-bedroom in Wicker Park with good light and a second room that could be an office or eventually something else, which is a sentence I let myself say out loud and noticed that I meant it. My mother came to visit in October. She met Cole over dinner and spent the whole meal asking him questions that were professionally casual and transparently evaluative, and he answered all of them with the same composed attention he brought to everything. And at the end of the night, she hugged him at the door. which she does not do with people she has reservations about. She pulled me into the kitchen while he was getting her coat. "Well," she said. "Well, what?" She gave me the look she gives me when I'm being deliberately slow. "He looks at you the way your father looked at me when I wasn't watching." I didn't tell her she was right. She already knew. There's a thing that happens when you've been in a relationship that was quietly designed to diminish you. You start to believe the diminishment was accurate, that the smaller version of yourself was the true size. And then someone pays attention, not to the performance of you, not to the version you've learned to make palatable, but to the actual you. The one who makes irrational requests and cries about her mother's property taxes and stands in a hallway watching egg yolks spread across a floor, and you have to decide whether to trust it. You don't trust it all at once. It comes in pieces. The specific memory he keeps. The dog who doesn't like everyone. The snickerdoodles in December, which I have thought about probably more than any reasonable person should think about cookies. I'm 33 now. I work from the second bedroom in Wicker Park, and the restaurant rebrand won a regional design award that I put on my website with only mild embarrassment. Cole's firm took on 2 new associates this year. Scout is getting a little grey around her muzzle, but still runs ahead and comes back. I pass women sometimes who look like I looked in those first weeks at the Ashwood Arms, a particular kind of careful stillness, the body language of someone who has just had the ground removed, and I want to say something, but there isn't really anything to say that would help yet. The only thing that helps is time and someone paying the right kind of attention. My grandfather's camera sits on the shelf in the hallway. I kept it. I never gave Marcus the $300. I never responded to the civility email. Some containers are just the wrong shape. You don't know that until you've been in one long enough. You don't know it until you find yourself standing in a new hallway with a broken egg at your feet, starting from almost nothing, and somebody opens a door. I used to think the hardest part was the leaving. Signing my name on papers that reduced 4 years to a single wire transfer, picking up a rolling suitcase, closing a door on a life I'd spent my best energy trying to make work. That felt like the bottom. I didn't know yet that bottoms have layers. What I understand now, not because someone told me, but because I live far enough past it to see it clearly, is that what Marcus did wasn't a single act. It was a pattern of small decisions, each one individually deniable, that together added up to something deliberate. The fertility testing steered toward me and never toward him. The career I quietly set aside because of logistics. The prenuptial that his own family's firm had written to be easy for him to invoke. None of those things would have looked like much on their own. Together they were architecture. A structure designed to make me smaller and keep me there. The thing about that kind of situation is that it works partly because you cooperate with it, not because you're foolish, because you're trying. You're trying to be reasonable, to be easy, to not be the kind of person who makes things difficult, and that trying, that genuine good faith effort gets used against you. I gave Marcus 4 years of trying and he handed me $5,000 and called it goodwill. I think about the version of me who almost paid him the $300 over my grandfather's camera, who was so tired that buying peace felt rational. What I know now is that every time you accept a small injustice to avoid conflict, you are not keeping the peace. You are teaching someone exactly how little it costs to wrong you. Marcus had been learning that lesson about me for years. I had been an excellent teacher. Cole was a different kind of education. Not because he rescued me. I want to be precise about this because the story could easily get told that way and it would be wrong. Cole didn't rescue me. He handed me information and then got out of the way while I decided what to do with it. He pointed me toward Denise. He told me not to give Marcus the $300, but the decision every time was mine. That's not a small distinction. It's the whole thing. What Cole actually gave me was the experience of being paid real attention by someone with no agenda attached to it. Or, to be more honest, Someone whose agenda eventually gave way to something more important than the original agenda. He could have kept the file and kept the distance. He chose not to. That choice cost him something, and he made it anyway. I think about the women I don't know. The other four cases in Denise's files. I think about whether any of them are standing in a hallway somewhere right now, with the ground recently removed, trying to figure out the shape of what comes next. I can't help them directly. But I know that the shape of what comes next is not determined by what was done to you. It is determined slowly and imperfectly by what you do with your own attention from here. Pay attention to what you accept. Pay attention to what you explain away. Pay attention to who listens to you like what you say is worth keeping and who listens only long enough to respond. My grandfather's camera is on the shelf in the hallway. Scout is getting gray around her muzzle. The light in Wicker Park in the morning is very good. I am 33 years old and I am exactly the right size.